Captain Elijah Carter exhaled deeply as he sank into the luxurious comfort of his first-class seat. The soft leather seemed to envelop him, a welcome reprieve from the demands of his usual role in the cockpit. Today, however, he wasn't at the controls. He was just another passenger, enjoying a rare opportunity to observe air travel from a different perspective. Dressed casually in well-worn jeans and a crisp navy shirt, he blended seamlessly with the other travelers, settling into the exclusive first-class cabin on the cross-country flight from Boston to San Diego. As Elijah stowed his carry-on in the overhead compartment, he allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. Experiencing first-class amenities from this side of the cabin door wasn't something he often had the luxury to do. His dark skin gleamed faintly under the cabin lights, a reminder of the humid Boston summer he had just escaped. From his bag, he pulled out a creased copy of Wings of Valor, an old favorite chronicling the early days of aviation. Perfect reading material for the journey. The steady hum of boarding passengers surrounded him, a mixture of chatter, shuffling luggage, and muted announcements. Elijah opened the book and immersed himself in its pages. Occasionally, he was aware of passengers casting curious glances in his direction. Despite being 2024, the sight of a black man in first class still seemed to turn heads on some flights. As the final first-class passengers took their seats, a flight attendant began making her rounds. Her name tag read Lauren, and she was a petite blonde with an expertly maintained smile that didn't quite touch her eyes. She moved with practiced efficiency, offering pre-flight beverages and ensuring passengers were comfortable. When Lauren reached Elijah, her smile faltered briefly, just enough for him to notice. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her tone carefully controlled, but carrying an edge. "I believe there might be an issue with your seating assignment. May I see your boarding pass?" Elijah blinked, momentarily caught off guard. Still, he calmly reached into his pocket and retrieved the ticket, handing it to her without comment. Lauren scrutinized it, her brow furrowing slightly as her eyes flicked from the ticket to Elijah and back again. "I'm sorry, sir, but there seems to be a mistake," she said, her tone taking on a patronizing edge. "This ticket is for first class, but unfortunately, we no longer have availability in this section. I'll need to ask you to move to the economy cabin." Elijah's stomach tightened. Though he had encountered subtle bias in the past, this was unexpectedly blatant. He met her gaze, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not sure I understand. My ticket clearly shows this is my assigned seat. Has there been a problem with the booking system?" Lauren's smile thinned, and her eyes darted nervously to the other passengers, some of whom were now paying close attention to the interaction. "Sir," she said, lowering her voice, "there's no issue with our system. However, this section is reserved for our premium passengers. I'm sure you can understand the confusion given your," she hesitated, "appearance." The weight of her implication was unmistakable, and Elijah felt a familiar mixture of anger and wariness wash over him. He had worked hard to rise above these moments, earning his captain's stripes despite challenges and prejudices. With a steadying breath, he reminded himself to remain composed. "Ma'am," he replied, his voice steady, but edged with authority. "I assure you, this is my assigned seat. If you'd like to confirm with your supervisor, I'll be happy to wait here." Lauren's smile disappeared entirely, replaced by a look of barely veiled irritation. "Sir, I am the lead flight attendant on this flight," she said curtly. "I'm asking you politely to gather your belongings and relocate to the economy section. There are passengers waiting to board, and I need this seat for its rightful occupant." As Elijah absorbed her words, he became acutely aware of the eyes on him. Some passengers watched with curiosity, others with discomfort, and a few with expressions he couldn't quite decipher. Whatever their thoughts, Elijah realized this moment was far from over. Should he disclose his identity as a pilot and risk humiliating Lauren, or should he comply with her request and address the injustice later? The decision was difficult, but Elijah decided to take the path of least resistance, for now. "Very well," he said, his voice taut with restrained emotion. "I'll move, but I insist on speaking with the captain before we depart." Lauren's relief was evident as she nodded briskly. "Of course, sir. I'm sure the captain will be happy to clarify our seating policies for you." As Elijah gathered his belongings and made his way toward the economy cabin, a familiar wave of frustration washed over him. He'd experienced this kind of treatment before, being judged, underestimated, or dismissed solely because of the color of his skin. The bitter déjà vu only deepened his resolve. How many more times would he have to prove his worth before people would see beyond their assumptions? Unbeknownst to Lauren, her actions had set in motion a series of events that would challenge not only her beliefs, but also those of everyone on board. Elijah sank into his cramped economy seat, a stark contrast to the spacious first-class accommodations he had just left. The downgrade was more than just physical. It was a glaring reminder of the discrimination he had endured. He took a steadying breath, recalling the many hurdles he had overcome to earn his captain's wings. This was yet another battle in a long journey, and he was determined to turn this indignity into a learning moment. The economy cabin was alive with the clatter of passengers wrestling with overhead compartments and jockeying for armrests. Elijah observed the scene with a practiced eye, noting the crew's efficiency and the varying moods of the travelers. Even out of the cockpit, his attention to detail was second nature. Just as he reopened his book, he noticed Lauren from earlier making her way down the aisle. She was gesturing animatedly while speaking with another crew member. When her eyes briefly met his, her expression changed, widening in surprise before she quickly looked away. It was clear that their earlier encounter was still the topic of conversation. Moments later, Lauren approached Elijah again. Her professional smile had returned, though it was strained at the edges. She leaned down slightly, keeping her voice low. "Sir, I've consulted with my colleague, and we believe there may have been a misunderstanding earlier. Could I see your boarding pass once more?" Elijah arched an eyebrow but complied, handing over the ticket without a word. Lauren examined it carefully, her brow knitting in concentration as she compared the information on the ticket to the man in front of her. "I see," she said slowly, her tone more tentative now. "It does appear that you were originally assigned a seat in first class. However," she added, straightening up, "we've had an overbooking situation and had to reassign some passengers. I sincerely apologize for the inconvenience." The explanation rang hollow. Elijah had spent enough years in the airline industry to recognize a feeble excuse when he heard one. "I see," he replied evenly, his tone giving nothing away. "And was I the only passenger reassigned due to this overbooking?" Lauren's smile faltered, and for a moment, uncertainty flickered across her face. "I'm not at liberty to discuss the arrangements of other passengers, sir," she said, clearly trying to regain her composure. "But I assure you, we're doing our best to accommodate everyone." Elijah leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "Miss Lauren, I think we both know that's not the full story. As I said earlier, I'd like to speak with the captain before we take off." Lauren's polished demeanor cracked further, a hint of nervousness slipping through. "Sir, the captain is currently occupied with pre-flight preparations," she said, her voice tinged with impatience. "I'm sure you understand how vital those are for everyone's safety." Her words hung in the air, but Elijah wasn't deterred. He knew this was far from over. The irony of Lauren's statement wasn't lost on Elijah. Her suggestion to speak with customer service after the flight landed in San Diego felt dismissive, almost calculated to deflect. "I'm afraid that won't work," Elijah said, his tone calm but resolute. "This issue needs to be addressed before departure. I have every right to occupy my assigned seat in first class, and I'd like a clear explanation for why I was removed." Lauren's patience was visibly fraying. "Sir," she said tightly, "I've already explained the situation. We have policies and procedures in place for a reason. Now I must ask you to drop this matter and prepare for takeoff, like everyone else." Their conversation was beginning to attract attention. Elijah noticed passengers nearby shifting in their seats, some openly staring, while others pretended to be engrossed in their magazines or phones, all the while stealing curious glances at the escalating situation. A middle-aged woman sitting across the aisle leaned toward Elijah, her voice soft with concern. "Is everything okay?" Before Elijah could respond, Lauren interjected swiftly. "Everything is fine, ma'am. Just a minor seating issue we're resolving." Her tone made it clear that she didn't intend for the discussion to involve anyone else. But Elijah saw an opportunity. "Actually," he said, his voice carrying just enough to ensure others could hear. "I was originally seated in first class but was asked to move to economy without a proper explanation. I'm simply trying to understand why." The woman's eyes widened, her gaze darting between Elijah and Lauren. She seemed unsure how to react. Lauren's smile grew even more forced. "Sir," she said, her voice clipped. "As I've mentioned, this was a necessary reassignment due to overbooking. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to finish preparing the cabin for departure." As Lauren turned to walk away, Elijah called after her. "I'm still waiting to speak with the captain. I expect this to be resolved before we take off." Lauren hesitated, her posture stiff with discomfort. After a moment, she turned back and nodded curtly. "I'll see what I can do," she muttered, before hurrying away down the aisle. Time dragged as the minutes ticked by. Elijah could feel the tension in the cabin steadily growing. Whispers rippled through the rows, and curious glances continued to be directed his way. His decision to stand his ground had stirred an undeniable sense of unease, but Elijah knew that sometimes the pursuit of justice meant facing discomfort, not just for himself, but for those around him. Settling back into his seat, his mind raced. How would this unfold? Would the captain intervene? And how would people react when they learned the full truth of who he was? The engines began to rumble, vibrating through the cabin as the aircraft prepared for takeoff. Elijah's jaw tightened as the tension thickened with each passing moment. Nearby, a young woman sitting 2 rows ahead kept turning to glance at him, her brow knitted in a mix of confusion and sympathy. Across the aisle, an older man removed his reading glasses, openly staring at Elijah. The man's weathered face seemed etched with conflicting emotions, as if he were struggling to reconcile the image of the well-spoken, composed black man with his own preconceived notions. Meanwhile, Lauren, the flight attendant who had inadvertently sparked the unfolding drama, was conspicuously absent. Elijah noticed her flitting back and forth near the front of the economy cabin, engaged in hushed conversations with other crew members and occasionally stealing furtive glances in his direction. Her demeanor made it clear that his request to speak with the captain had disrupted the usual pre-flight routine. As the moments dragged on, Elijah's frustration mounted. Remaining calm had always been his strength, but this time the injustice felt heavier than usual. This wasn't just about his seat, it was about something far greater. The murmurs of passengers, the glances, and the hushed tension swirling around him only reinforced the importance of seeing this through. Elijah Carter was used to being in control, accustomed to having a clear understanding of any situation he faced. Yet here, without his uniform or the authority it symbolized, he felt an unfamiliar sense of powerlessness. A reminder of the countless battles he'd fought to reach his position and the struggles that still loomed for others who shared his experiences. The seatbelt sign illuminated with a ding, and a flight attendant's voice crackled through the intercom, instructing passengers to prepare for takeoff. Elijah's heart sank as he realized his request to speak with the captain might be ignored. Then, a commotion near the front of the cabin caught his attention. Lauren was engaged in what appeared to be a heated conversation with another crew member. Though their voices were low, their animated body language was impossible to miss. Lauren's face was flushed, her gestures frantic, while the other crew member, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and a stern expression, remained resolute and calm. Elijah watched as the man's gaze suddenly shifted, locking onto his. Recognition flashed across the man's face, quickly followed by what could only be described as horrified realization. Without another word to Lauren, the man turned on his heel and began making his way down the aisle toward Elijah. The cabin fell into an expectant silence as passengers sensed the unfolding significance. Even the usual background noise of shuffling bags and clicking seatbelts seemed to vanish, replaced by murmurs of curiosity and tension. The man reached Elijah's row and leaned in, his voice low but urgent. "Captain Carter," he said, the formality of the address leaving no doubt. "I'm First Officer Daniel Hayes. It seems there's been a terrible misunderstanding. Would you please come with me?" A ripple of murmurs swept through the nearby passengers. Elijah caught snippets of disbelief. Did he say captain? I thought he was just a passenger. Oh my God, what have they done? Elijah stood slowly, his eyes never leaving Hayes's face. I'd be happy to, he said, his voice calm but carrying a steel-like undertone. I believe there are some things I need to discuss with the crew. As they walked toward the front of the plane, Elijah could feel the weight of every passenger's gaze on him. The whispers grew louder, a mix of outrage, embarrassment, and astonishment. When they reached the galley, he caught sight of Lauren standing stiffly against the wall, her face pale and her expression a mask of mortification. First Officer Hayes led Elijah to the cockpit door and paused before opening it. "Captain," Hayes began, his voice heavy with regret, "I want to personally apologize on behalf of the entire crew. This should never have happened." Elijah gave a curt nod, acknowledging the apology, but withholding any acceptance. "Let's move forward," he replied evenly. When the cockpit door swung open, Elijah straightened his shoulders and stepped inside. The familiar sight of instruments, controls, and flight gauges felt like a homecoming. Yet the atmosphere inside the cockpit was far from ordinary. The crew members present looked up, their faces a mix of embarrassment, shock, and dawning recognition. Elijah took a deep breath as the door closed behind him. The next moments would be critical, not just for him but for everyone aboard the flight. This was an opportunity to transform a humiliating experience into a moment of teaching, to challenge assumptions and dismantle biases. He vowed silently to make the most of it. Little did he know that his actions in the next few minutes would ripple far beyond the confines of this flight, influencing the lives of everyone on board in ways they could never have imagined. The cockpit fell into a tense silence as Elijah's presence filled the small space. The plane's current captain, a middle-aged man with streaks of gray in his hair, rose from his seat. His face was a mixture of confusion and slowly dawning understanding. The man extended his hand, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "I'm Captain Daniel Rivera. I'm not entirely sure I understand what's going on here." Elijah Carter accepted the handshake with a firm grip, his demeanor professional despite the emotions churning beneath his calm exterior. "Captain Rivera, it appears there's been a serious misunderstanding," Elijah began. "I was scheduled to relieve you for the second leg of this flight. However, due to an issue with the cabin crew, I was removed from my first-class seat and sent to economy." Captain Rivera's eyes widened in disbelief as he glanced between Elijah and First Officer Hayes, who had followed them into the cockpit. "Removed from first class? But why on earth?" he trailed off, the unspoken implication hanging heavily in the air. Elijah took a measured breath, carefully choosing his words. "I believe certain assumptions were made about my right to be in the first-class cabin. Assumptions based, well, on my appearance." A deafening silence followed his statement. Captain Rivera's face flushed, a mix of anger and embarrassment clouding his features. "This is absolutely unacceptable," he said, his voice tight with restrained fury. "I assure you, Captain Carter, this will be addressed immediately." As if on cue, a knock sounded on the cockpit door. First Officer Hayes opened it to reveal Lauren, the flight attendant at the center of the controversy. She looked pale, her usual air of confidence replaced by visible distress. "Captains," Lauren began, her voice trembling, I've come to apologize. I made a terrible mistake, and Captain Rivera raised a hand, cutting her off. "Lauren, we'll discuss this in detail later," he said firmly. "For now, I need you to make an announcement to the passengers. Inform them there will be a slight delay due to a crew change, and let them know I will address them shortly." Lauren nodded hastily, her eyes darting nervously to Elijah, before she turned and retreated from the cockpit. As the door clicked shut behind her, Captain Rivera turned back to Elijah, his expression somber. "Captain Carter, I cannot express how deeply sorry I am for what you've endured. This is not reflective of our airline's values, and I want to make this right. I'd like you to take command of this flight as originally planned, if you're willing. I think it's important for the passengers to see you in your rightful place." Elijah hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing on him. A part of him wanted to walk off the plane and leave the humiliation behind. But a larger part of him saw the opportunity to turn this painful experience into a powerful teaching moment. "Thank you, Captain Rivera," Elijah replied. "I'll take command. But first, I'd like to address the passengers directly. It's important they understand what happened today." Captain Rivera nodded solemnly. "Of course, Whatever you feel is necessary. A flustered ground crew member arrived with Elijah's uniform, and he quickly changed. Through the cockpit door, he could hear the murmurs of confused passengers. The news of the crew change had clearly sparked curiosity and speculation. Once dressed, Elijah took a steadying breath and stepped out of the cockpit. The cabin fell silent as he walked to the front of the first-class section, every eye following his movements. He could see the shock and dawning realization on the faces of those who had witnessed his earlier interaction with Lauren. Elijah picked up the intercom handset. His voice was steady and clear as he began to speak. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Captain Elijah Carter, and I'll be taking command of this flight to San Diego. Before we depart, I feel it's necessary to address an incident that occurred during boarding. He paused, allowing his words to sink in. The cabin was so silent, it seemed as though everyone was holding their breath. Earlier today, I was asked to relinquish my seat in first class and move to economy. This was not due to overbooking or any issue with logistics, but because assumptions were made about me. Assumptions based on my appearance. I want to be clear, Elijah Carter continued, his voice steady yet resonant. This kind of discrimination has no place in our society, let alone on an airline. We must look beyond our assumptions and treat everyone we meet with respect and dignity. The color of someone's skin, their gender, or any other external factor should never determine their worth as a human being. Elijah scanned the cabin, meeting the gazes of passengers with a firm yet compassionate expression. On their faces, he saw a range of emotions: shame, anger, sympathy, and in some cases, an uncomfortable acknowledgement of their own biases. I'm not sharing this to assign blame, he added, his tone softening. I'm sharing it to remind us of an important truth. We all carry preconceptions, but it's how we challenge them that defines us. I've chosen to continue as your captain today because I believe in leading by example. My hope is that by the end of this flight, we'll all have learned something valuable about judgment, respect, and the power of rising above adversity. As Elijah concluded, the cabin remained silent for a beat. Then a slow clap began in the first-class section. It spread like a ripple through the plane, building steadily until passengers from economy to first class were standing, clapping with fervor. Some had tears streaming down their faces, overwhelmed by the impact of his words. At the back of the first-class cabin, Lauren stood frozen, her face a mixture of mortification and awe. As the applause began to subside, she approached Elijah cautiously, her voice barely above a whisper. Captain Carter, she said, her eyes downcast, I'm so sorry. I don't even know where to begin to make this right. Elijah regarded her for a long moment. He didn't see just the flight attendant who had wronged him. He saw a person capable of growth, someone willing to face their mistakes. Lauren, he said gently, the first step is acknowledging where we've fallen short. The second is committing to learn from it. I trust you'll do both. She nodded, tears threatening to spill as she backed away. Elijah turned and headed toward the cockpit, ready to resume his duties. But this flight had already become about far more than simply transporting passengers. It was a chance to move everyone on board closer to a deeper understanding of equality. As Elijah settled into the captain's seat, he felt an undeniable sense of purpose. He wasn't just flying a plane, he was leading hearts and minds to higher altitudes. In the cabin, the passengers were buzzing with conversation. The weight of what had just occurred hung in the air, sparking reflection and dialogue among strangers. A distinguished older man in first class leaned toward his seatmate, his voice low but emphatic. In all my years of flying, I've never seen anything like this. What happened to that man was disgraceful, but the way he handled it, that's leadership. His seatmate, a young woman in a sharp business suit, nodded fervently. I saw it all. I wanted to say something, but I didn't. God, I feel awful now. We just sat here and let it happen. In the economy section, the atmosphere was equally charged. A middle-aged woman with warm eyes wiped away tears as she turned to her husband. Can you believe it? A hero was sitting right here, and we didn't even realize it. It makes you think, how many times have we misjudged someone without even knowing? Her husband, a burly man with a gruff demeanor, cleared his throat, clearly holding back emotion. You're right, he said. This is a wake-up call for all of us. We've got to do better. At the back of the plane, a group of college students who had witnessed the initial confrontation were engaged in an animated discussion. "Did you see her face when she realized who he was?" one of them said, a mix of disbelief and awkward amusement in his tone. His friend nudged him sharply. "Come on, man. This isn't about gloating. It's about learning. We all need to check our biases. Be honest. What would you have thought if you'd seen a guy like him in first class before today?" The question lingered in the group, sparking a reflective silence. The realization hung heavy, driving home the lessons of the day. If you saw a black man sitting in first class, what would your first thought be? The question lingered in the air among the college students, creating an uneasy silence. Each of them looked inward, grappling with the uncomfortable truths it revealed. Meanwhile, the cabin crew remained in a state of quiet disarray. Lauren, the flight attendant at the center of the incident, stood in the galley, her hands trembling as she tried to compose herself. A fellow crew member approached, resting a supportive hand on her shoulder. "Lauren, are you okay?" they asked softly. Lauren shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "I can't believe I was so blind, so prejudiced," she whispered. "I've always thought of myself as fair and professional. But today I became the kind of person I've always despised." Her colleague gave her shoulder a gentle squeeze. "What matters now is what you do moving forward," they said. "Captain Carter gave us all a chance to reflect and grow from this. Don't let it go to waste." As the initial shock of the situation began to subside, passengers started approaching the flight attendants, asking how they could show their support for Captain Carter. Some suggested writing notes of apology and encouragement, while others proposed a collection for a donation to an anti-discrimination organization in the airline's name. The energy on the flight had shifted. What began as a routine journey had turned into a powerful collective experience, prompting passengers to reevaluate their beliefs and behavior. In the cockpit, Elijah Carter remained focused on the pre-flight checklist. His movements were precise, his exterior calm and composed. Yet, inside, he couldn't ignore the emotional weight of the day. First Officer Hayes, sitting beside him, observed Elijah with a mix of admiration and guilt. Finally, Hayes spoke, his voice hesitant. "Captain Carter, I just want to say, how you handled everything back there was incredible. It's inspiring. I'm honored to be flying with you today." Elijah paused, turning to face Hayes. His expression softened. "Thank you, Hayes," he replied. "But this isn't just about me. It's about all of us recognizing our shared humanity and treating each other with the respect we all deserve." As the engines roared to life and the plane began its slow taxi toward the runway, the atmosphere on board was palpably different. This was no longer just a physical journey from Boston to San Diego. It had become an emotional and moral voyage for everyone involved. When the plane lifted off the ground, it carried more than just passengers and cargo. It bore the weight of newfound awareness and the promise of change. The skies ahead were clear, but the road to true equality and respect would still have turbulence to navigate. At 35,000 feet, the cabin grew quiet, the initial shock of the pre-flight events settling into introspective calm. Some passengers stared out the windows, lost in thought, while others engaged in quiet, meaningful conversations about what they had witnessed. In the cockpit, Elijah expertly guided the aircraft, his posture professional and assured. But within him, emotions churned. He reflected on his early days in aviation. The uphill battles, the moments of dismissal and doubt he had endured simply because of his race. Today's events were painful, but they weren't unfamiliar. Sensing the weight of the moment, Hayes broke the silence. "Captain, if you don't mind me asking, how do you do it? How do you face this kind of prejudice and still stay so composed?" Elijah took a moment before responding, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "It's not easy, Hayes," he admitted. "There are days when the weight of it feels unbearable. But every time I step into this cockpit, every time I put on this uniform, I remind myself of something important. I'm not just flying a plane. I'm breaking barriers, challenging stereotypes, and paving the way for others who look like me." Elijah Carter paused, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It's about turning pain into purpose," he said quietly. "Every act of discrimination I face is a chance to educate, to shift perspectives, and to make things a little better for the next generation." In the first-class cabin, Lauren, the flight attendant, was wrestling with the consequences of her actions. As she carried out her duties, she could feel the weight of the passengers' eyes on her, some accusatory, others tinged with pity. Each step she took seemed heavier than the last. Finally, during a lull, she retreated to the galley, breathing deeply in an attempt to steady herself. A colleague noticed her distress and approached gently. "Lauren," they began softly, "I can see how much this is weighing on you. But remember what Captain Carter said. It's about learning from our mistakes. This can be a turning point for you, if you allow it to be." Lauren nodded, brushing away a tear. "You're right," she said shakily. I never saw myself as prejudiced. This has forced me to confront some very uncomfortable truths about who I am." Meanwhile, in the economy cabin, the group of college students who had been talking earlier was now engaged in a deeper conversation about systemic racism and implicit bias. "I always thought I was pretty woke," one of them admitted, shaking their head. "But today made me realize how much I still have to learn. How many times have I made snap judgments about people without even realizing it?" Their friend nodded solemnly. "It's not enough to just not be racist," they replied. "We need to be actively anti-racist. That means calling out discrimination when we see it, even if it makes us uncomfortable." As the flight continued, passengers began writing notes to Captain Carter. What started as a trickle of messages grew into a flood. Flight attendants moved up and down the aisles, collecting scraps of paper filled with apologies, words of support, and promises to do better. In the cockpit, First Officer Hayes received word of the growing outpouring. Turning to Elijah, he said, "Captain, the passengers, they're writing you messages. There are hundreds of them. I've never seen anything like this." Elijah smiled softly, moved by the gesture, but grounded in reality. "It's a start," he said. "But the real test will be what happens after we land. Will they carry these lessons into their lives? Will they speak up the next time they witness discrimination?" As the plane began its descent into San Diego, a palpable sense of transformation filled the air. Passengers who had boarded as strangers now shared a collective experience, one that had forged a new understanding and a commitment to change. Summoning her courage, Lauren approached the cockpit during the final preparations for landing. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "Captain Carter," she began, "I know my earlier apology wasn't enough. I want you to know that this experience has changed me. I'm committed to confronting my biases and becoming a better person. I hope that someday I can earn your forgiveness." Elijah regarded her with a steady, compassionate gaze. "Lauren," he said gently, "forgiveness isn't something you earn, it's something you give, both to others and to yourself. What matters now is what you do with this experience. Let it guide you to become the person I believe you can be." As the plane's wheels touched down on the runway, it was clear that this journey had been far more than a simple flight from Boston to San Diego. It had become a voyage of self-discovery, a lesson in humanity, and for many, the first step toward true understanding and equality. When the seatbelt sign dinged off, no one moved right away. The atmosphere was heavy with the sense that something profound had taken place, something that couldn't simply be left behind on the aircraft. As Elijah's voice came over the intercom, one last time, thanking everyone for flying and wishing them well, the cabin erupted into spontaneous applause. It wasn't just a response to a smooth flight or excellent service, it was an acknowledgement of the powerful experience they had shared together. As the passengers disembarked, many lingered, hoping to catch a glimpse of Captain Elijah Carter, to shake his hand, to thank him for what he had inspired. When Elijah finally emerged from the cockpit, he was met by a sea of faces, diverse, yet united by a newfound understanding. The impact of this flight would ripple far beyond the confines of the aircraft. It would spark conversations at kitchen tables, in workplaces, and across communities. It would challenge deeply rooted beliefs and inspire action. For Elijah, it was a powerful reminder of why he continued to fly, not just to traverse the skies, but to rise above prejudice and illuminate a path for others to follow. As the last passengers exited, the terminal at San Diego International Airport buzzed with an energy unlike any other day. News of the extraordinary events aboard the flight had spread quickly, and a small crowd of curious onlookers and media had gathered near the gate. When Captain Elijah Carter stepped off the jet bridge, his posture was upright, his captain's uniform a badge of perseverance and accomplishment. He was greeted by spontaneous applause that quickly grew into a thunderous ovation. Passengers from the flight, airport staff, and even bystanders from other flights joined in, their applause echoing through the terminal. Among the crowd stood Lauren, the flight attendant at the heart of the earlier incident. She remained quiet, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. As the applause subsided, she hesitated, then approached Elijah with measured steps. "Captain Carter," she began, her voice barely audible over the hum of the terminal. "I know I've already apologized, but I need to say it again. What I did was inexcusable, and Elijah raised a hand, gently silencing her. His voice was calm yet resolute. "Lauren," he said, "apologies are important, but actions speak louder than words. What will you do differently? Tomorrow? Next week? Next year?" Lauren straightened, her expression shifting from guilt to determination. "I've already spoken to HR," she said. "I volunteered to join the airline's diversity and inclusion initiatives. I want to share my story, my mistake, to help others learn, and I've signed up for implicit bias training. It's a start, but I'm committed to doing better." A small smile played at the corners of Elijah's lips. "That," he said, "is how change begins. One person at a time, one action at a time." As they spoke, a group of passengers from the flight gathered nearby. An elderly gentleman leaning heavily on a cane stepped forward. "Captain Carter," he said, his voice quavering with emotion. "I've been flying for over 5 decades, and I've never experienced anything like this. You've taught this old dog some new tricks, and for that, I'm grateful." A young woman, the business executive from first class, chimed in. "You've inspired us all, Captain. We've started a social media campaign. Flying Above Prejudice is already trending. People are sharing their stories and pledging to do better." Elijah was touched by their enthusiasm, but understood that real change required more than viral moments. "That's a wonderful start," he said, his tone measured. "But remember, the real work happens in our daily lives. In the small moments when no one is watching, it's about choosing empathy over judgment, understanding over assumption, every single day." The crowd fell silent, hanging on his every word. A reporter, having caught wind of the story, stepped forward with a microphone in hand. "Captain Carter, can you tell us more about what happened on your flight? How do you feel about becoming an unexpected symbol for change?" Elijah paused, considering his response carefully. Elijah Carter knew that his response to the reporter's question would shape how the story would be told and how it might inspire change. He took a steadying breath, his voice firm but measured as he began. "What happened today," he said, "isn't just about me. It's a mirror held up to our society, reflecting the biases that still persist in our everyday interactions. But it also shows our capacity for growth, our ability to recognize mistakes and come together in the face of injustice." His words carried the weight of years of hard-earned wisdom. "I don't see myself as a symbol," Elijah continued, "but as a catalyst. If what happened today starts conversations, shifts perspectives, and inspires action, then something good will have come from a difficult situation. That's how progress happens, not through grand gestures, but through countless small moments of awareness and choice." The reporter pressed on, asking, "What would you say to others who might face similar discrimination?" Elijah's expression softened, his thoughts turning to the many people who endure prejudice every day, often without the platform or voice he now had. "To anyone facing discrimination," he began, "I want to say this. Your worth is not determined by others' perceptions. Stand tall in your truth. Simply being present in spaces where you're underrepresented is an act of courage and change. But don't carry the burden alone. Seek support, share your stories, and know that for every person who judges you unfairly, there are many others who will stand with you." As Elijah spoke, he noticed a group of young aviation students gathered at the edge of the crowd, their wide-eyed admiration evident. He beckoned them forward, addressing them directly. "The future of aviation, and of society, rests with you," he said. "Dream big. Work hard and never let anyone's preconceptions limit your potential. The skies belong to everyone." The students smiled brightly, clearly moved. One of them, a young black woman, stepped forward. "Captain Carter," she said, her voice filled with emotion, "you've shown us what's possible. You've broken barriers and inspired us all. Thank you for paving the way." As the impromptu gathering began to thin out, Elijah felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to see First Officer Hayes standing there, his posture slightly hesitant. "Captain," Hayes began, his voice low, "I owe you an apology too. I didn't speak up when I should have. I was so focused on following protocols and procedures that I failed to see the bigger picture. That won't happen again." Elijah clasped Hayes' shoulder firmly. "Thank you, Hayes," he said. "Being an ally means using your voice and your position to advocate for others, especially when it's uncomfortable. I'm counting on you to do that moving forward." Later that day, Elijah found himself in the airline's executive offices. The CEO, a poised woman in her late 50s, rose from her desk to greet him. "Captain Carter," she began, her tone a mix of admiration and regret, "let me first offer my personal apology for what you experienced. It was unacceptable, and we will be implementing concrete steps to address this at every level of our organization." She paused, studying him with a thoughtful expression. "But I also want to thank you. The way you handled this situation was nothing short of exemplary. We'd like to work with you to develop a comprehensive diversity and inclusion training program for all of our staff. Your insights would be invaluable." Elijah nodded, feeling a cautious sense of optimism. "I appreciate that," he replied, "and I'd be honored to contribute. But this can't just be a reactionary measure or a PR move. It needs to be a fundamental shift in culture and policy." The CEO nodded in agreement. "Absolutely. We're committed to lasting change. In fact, we'd like to offer you a new role, overseeing our diversity and inclusion initiatives alongside your flying duties. Your experience in leadership could transform not just our airline but the industry as a whole." Elijah felt the enormity of the moment, but remained grounded. "If it means real change," he said, "I'm all in." As Elijah Carter left the office that evening, the weight of the day's events finally began to settle on his shoulders. He was exhausted, but within him burned a spark of hope. He knew that one flight, one conversation, couldn't undo the deep-rooted issues of prejudice and discrimination. But it was a start. He thought of Lauren, the flight attendant, and her commitment to change. He thought of the passengers who had been moved to act, the young aviation students inspired to pursue their dreams, and the corporate leadership now determined to implement systemic reforms. As Elijah walked through the quiet terminal, he allowed himself a small, reflective smile. Today, he had done more than pilot a plane. He had elevated the conversation, challenged perceptions, and set in motion a series of events that could lead to lasting change. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to break barriers and shift perspectives. But for now, Captain Elijah Carter headed home, knowing that today he had truly soared above prejudice, proving to others that they could do the same. The story of Flight 2574 would be told and retold, not merely as a tale of discrimination overcome, but as a beacon of hope for a more inclusive and understanding future. It stood as a powerful reminder that the most meaningful journeys we undertake are not those that span physical distances, but those that bridge the gaps in our hearts and minds. As Elijah stepped out into the cool evening air, he gazed up at the star-studded sky. The same stars that had guided aviators for generations now seemed to shine with renewed purpose, lighting the path toward a more equitable and compassionate world. With his head held high and his spirit unbroken, Captain Elijah Carter was ready to lead the way. This story opposes all forms of discrimination, racism, prejudice, and violations of human rights. It is an original work, created to promote reflection, awareness, and meaningful dialogue. All content respects diversity and upholds the dignity of all individuals.